Alright, now that we have our virtual environment and imports in order, let's go ahead and start building our application. I'm going to enter the project directory on the desktop. I'm going to open an instance of the terminal within the root project directory. I'm now going to make sure that the virtual environment is active. In my case it is not, so I'm going to reactivate that. In similar fashion to before, we're going to use source, and then we will specify the path to the activation script. Alright, so the double dots there took us back to the desktop, and because the environment's contained in a directory on the desktop, then we entered the environments directory, the project environment, specific environment, and we give it the whole path. So now the environment is active. We can confirm that we have the correct packages still installed. Looks good. Now we're going to enter into the project root directory within the terminal. Alright, we're already in that, and that's good. We never left it. Currently the directory is empty. We're going to create two files within this directory. Within the root directory here of the project, we're going to create a file to contain the bulk of our Python code. Using the terminal, we can create the file, and I will call it db, let's call it dbapp.py. So we've now got that file, and we're also going to create a subdirectory within the project directory. I'm going to call this directory templates. I believe that name is required by Flask, so make sure that the name matches templates exactly. Now going to enter that directory and create another file. And this file will be called home.html. This will be the one and only HTML file. It'll specify the structure of the application. And now that we have that, let's go ahead and start working on the Python code. I'm going to use the Sublime text editor. I like to open up the text editor, and in this case we can drag and drop. You can now see the project structure. We've got a tree over here which shows the structure of the whole thing. For our Python file, we'll start with the import statements. We'll be importing a couple of packages from a couple of packages, specifically Flask. We're going to import the Flask class. We'll also use the render template function, which will allow us to display HTML. We'll be using request to test if information is being sent to or requested from the server by the client. We'll also be using WT forms. We'll use two things from WT forms: string field, which will accept user input, and the submit field, which will allow the client to send information to the server. We'll also use Flask WTF Flask form, which facilitates integration of WT forms into Flask. We'll use that as a base class for one of our forms that we'll be defining here shortly. We'll start by creating an instance of the Flask class, and we're going to pass in the name of the current module. So this right here is we're going to call that instance dbapp. We're going to create the instance of the Flask application, which we imported up here. And right here we have dunder, _name, and that is a special variable which is set by Python. It is set equal to main if this module is run directly, and it is set equal to the name of the module if this module is being imported as part of another module. And there's also a little more boilerplate code here. Typically there's an if conditional statement, generally down at the bottom, which tests to see if that name, special name variable, is equal to the string main. If it is, then this module is being run directly, and we're going to call run on the instance of the app to start this application. And here we're passing in debug equals true. That will turn on the debugger, so we'll get additional information about the application as it is running. Next thing we're going to want to do is set a couple of configuration parameters for our application here. So our application, DB app, contains a special data type, which is basically a dictionary. And that dictionary contains key value pairs. One of the keys is secret key. As this is a key name, it does need to match exactly. And we're going to set the secret key in the config dictionary of our application equal to 123. In a production environment, you should definitely use something more secure. We're also going to set the SQL Alchemy database URI equal to SQLite. And we're going to use 3 forward slashes to create this database in the project root directory. And we will call this database testdb. Next thing we're doing here on line 11 is creating an instance of SQL Alchemy. And now we're going to define 2 different classes. We're going to define a class for the form, which we will be putting together on the HTML, home HTML file. This form will inherit from Flask form as a base class, and it will contain 3 attributes, one of which will be a string field. The string field, which we imported from WT Forms, has a username label. The password, which is also a string field, contains a password label. These string fields can accept an optional keyword parameter, which is a list of validators. Validators can also be imported from WT Forms. And what validators do is they can impose additional restrictions or requirements on user input. That can help to ensure data integrity and security. We won't be doing that because we're focused on the database itself and deploying to Heroku. In a production environment, you'd probably want to use a password field for the password, as that does provide masking of input, which prevents someone looking over the user's shoulder and getting their password by reading it off the screen. So that's useful for security, but in the interest of simplicity, 2 string fields and a submit field. The next class we will define is the user class, and this is going to be our database model. As it is a database model for our SQL Alchemy ORM, we will inherit from the DB model base class. We're going to set the primary key as an integer. It's going to be a column, and it's called ID. We're going to create 2 columns in this model, and we're going to, those will accept strings, and we put a maximum length of 20 on those strings. The next thing we're going to do is create the routes. And what a route does is that it establishes a URI endpoint at which, if the server receives a request, it will perform a specific action. So this route, a route is a decorated function. Decorated functions are prefaced with the @ symbol. So we're going to do @ and then the name of our application, which in our case is dbapp.route. And here's where we specify the endpoint. For this particular route, it will be the root, so it is simply a /. And the next thing we're going to do is set the methods which this endpoint will accept. For this application, we'll be accepting both post and get requests on one single root page. So we're going to set methods equal to a list of strings. By default, a route accepts get requests, but a route can also accept post requests if specified. So we're going to set it to accept post requests. And though it does accept get requests by default, if setting it to accept post, then you do need to explicitly set get. So that's all looking good. Now we're going to define the view function, which we're going to name home, and we're going to give this so once again, when the application receives a request at this endpoint, the function, decorated function below, will be executed. So we're going to give that function a body. The first thing we're going to do is create an instance of the registration form. And then we're going to add a conditional statement here. So if request.method, and what that does is it tests the method which was used to communicate with the server. So if the method is with two equal sign, testing for equality, if it's equal to the string post, then we're going to perform this action. We're going to read information from the form, which we'll set up on the home HTML. We're going to read information from that form, and we're going to store it into a couple variables. So username is going to be equal to form.username.data, and that'll be information from this form, which will be filled by the HTML, which we'll see shortly. And we're also going to, alright, this completion is getting a little bit annoying. Alright, I'm going to set password equal to form.password.data. And now we're also going to create an instance of a user. So this user model, which we defined up here, we're going to create an instance of that. So this does need to be capitalized. And we're going to create it using keyword arguments. So username is going to be equal to this username value, and password is going to be equal to this password value. So username is equal to username, and password is equal to password. And now that we have a user, we can add that user to the database. We're going to do that using SQL Alchemy. So db.session.add, and we can add that user. This user right here, which we created, is going to be added to the database. And the add command doesn't actually add it to the database. It adds it to basically a staging area. And now that we've added it to that staging area, we can commit it using db.session and commit. Now the information has actually been added to the database. We're going to add another line down here, which will be run in both cases, whether this was a post request or not. So whether it was a post or a GET request, we will run users. We'll set a variable, users, equal to all the information contained in the database. So user, the database, .query.all. That's going to read the information from the database and store that in users. Now we're going to return render template. We're going to use the render template function to read the HTML and actually some of the embedded Python, which we'll be adding shortly, and to display it within the browser. So the first thing we do is pass in the HTML file, the name of the HTML file, which must be contained in the templates folder. So a string containing the name. And we're also going to pass in two additional variables. So these values, form, which is this form. And we could name this something else if we wanted to, but form is a good name. So we're going to pass in form. And we're going to also pass in users, set that equal to users. And what that did is that's going to make this information, both form and users, available within this scope context kind of deal. So now that that's all in order, let's take a quick break and then we'll jump into writing the HTML.